All right. Well, this week we are in the fourth part of a series called Doubt. And I hope that this series has been helpful for you if you've been with us the past couple weeks. Whether you've been in church for years and years and years or you're totally new to church, hopefully this series has given you some tools in your belt when it comes to handling issues of doubt. Now, if you're just joining us for the first time, basically what we've said, or even for the first time in this series, what we've said to kind of recap, refresh a little bit, we've said really like doubt, it's the feeling, it's the emotion that comes with uncertainty, right? Like it's what you feel when you ask your 6-year-old son if his room is clean and he says yes. It's what you feel like. I remember growing up, we'd be somewhere with my parents, and I'd be like, when are we leaving? And they'd be like, 5 minutes. And I'd be like, I don't know. You know, there's some doubt. Or maybe you're in a relationship, and it's like, is everything okay? I'm fine. Like, I don't know about that, right? It's the feeling like I'm not totally sure, maybe, what if, there's a lack of certainty. It's a little bit shaky. Now, doubt in general can be a really good thing. You know, there are some situations you should not just storm into with complete confidence. I remember when I was younger, like one year we went for New Year's Eve, we went to New Hampshire, and it was cold up there. There was a big, gigantic lake, and we went out. Everyone wanted to go out. Oh, let's go out on the frozen lake. And I was like, I don't know. I have seen too many episodes of Rescue 911 as a child to go out on a frozen lake. And they did, and everybody was fine. But the whole time, like, all I can think about is, like, what happens if, you know, my confidence is gone. And so sometimes you should be skeptical. It's helpful. But when doubt enters into the church or the church conversation or the idea of faith, God, Jesus, a lot of times the feeling of doubt comes with feelings that are unwelcome. And feelings that really shouldn't be there. And sometimes we don't even address them. We don't even give them names. But often doubting God or having questions about God or being uncertain about what the person from the front is saying, a lot of times that comes with feelings of guilt or shame, like you're doing something wrong and you're not gonna measure up, or maybe even anger and frustration. Doubt can feel all different ways and it can look different ways. You know, you can doubt the whole operation from A to Z. Just be like, I don't know about all this. I don't know about these people. I don't even know why I'm here, right? Maybe you were there just a couple minutes ago. Or you can doubt just little aspects of it. You could doubt for a minute. You can doubt for months. Doubt comes in all different shapes and sizes. And so what we've been saying is like, well, what do you do? What do you do with doubt? We haven't necessarily put any one specific doubt to rest. But what we're talking about is how to handle these things. And so if you're someone who considers themselves a person of faith or a follower of Jesus, hopefully these for you will be like tools you have when you have those feelings, those moments, those seasons even of doubt. And if you're someone who doesn't believe at all, I get that, I've been there. But my hope for you, like if you're like me, maybe knowing how we believe God wants us to handle our doubt, like that for you could be enough to pull you in the direction of faith. So what do we do with our doubts? How do we handle them? How should we see them? How should we feel about them? And how do we deal with them? Well, on the first week, what we said, like just to lay the baseline, we said, real quick, we said, it's okay to doubt. You need to know that. We looked at a story where Jesus talked about this guy named John the Baptist. And if you don't know much about John the Baptist, he was like a religious rock star. He was the most loyal follower of Jesus, one of the earliest followers of Jesus. And at the end of his life, he has this huge crisis of faith. Like he's not even sure if the person he dedicated his entire life to is who he said he was. And he doubts. And instead of Jesus like dropping the hammer, like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you would doubt me, he shows compassion and understanding. And then turns around to the crowd and brags about John, who's not even there. And we said, okay, if you're feeling doubt, like the very first thing, the foundation, what you need to know is you should be aware of them, but don't be ashamed of them. The worst thing you can do with a doubt is compound it with feelings of guilt and shame. That will lead you nowhere helpful. And then the following week, we talked about these people. They're known as the Bereans. They came after Jesus, and this guy, Paul, goes telling people about Jesus to these people. And it says they didn't take his word for it. Like, they didn't just listen to him. They took what he said, and they went home, and they did their own homework to see if what he said was true. They doubted him. They were skeptical of him, and they were commended for it. Because this message, we believe, holds water. And so go ahead. Ask your questions. Dig into it. We said, engage your doubts. Don't ignore them. Ask your questions. It's okay to be skeptical. I said even here, like you hear me say something, don't take my word for it. Go home and find out for yourself. Then last week, Tom was up here, who does everything, by the way. Do you see he sings, he plays the guitar, he plays the drums, and then he turns and plays the piano from the drums during one song. He's not in the room. I wouldn't have said that if he was. So he talked about Thomas. And Thomas is Doubting Thomas, right? That's how we know him, as Doubting Thomas. It's because after Jesus was killed, he's the guy who said, after he came back, he's like, I don't believe it, and I'll never believe it unless I can stick my fingers in the holes in his hands. But through all of it, he continues to show up over and over and over again. He doesn't abandon his crew. And if you take anything away from the story of Thomas, it's well, we said admit your doubts, but don't quit. Don't throw everything out in your season of uncertainty. Don't make life-changing decisions when you're in the valley. And we see that in Thomas, and he continues to show up. And in doing that, he sees what he needs to see to believe, right? So that's where we've been over the past few weeks. Today, the time we have left, I got a story for you, all right? So a couple weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, Allie and I went away. We went to a whole week of marriage therapy. It's not like we were in crisis or anything. We're just like, trying to figure each other out, be intentional about the relationship. And now we completely understand each other. I'm just kidding. So anyway, we go away. It was great. We had a great time. We went to Tampa, and we get on the plane. It's a Sunday, right after the service, 2 weeks ago. I run out of here. We get in the car, and we rush through security. Finally, we get into the plane. We just made the flight. I sit down, and I'm tired. The plane hasn't even taken off yet. I buckle that high-tech seatbelt, and I just go right to sleep. Head back, mouth open. I didn't have my duct tape to cover my mouth. And I just pass out, go to sleep. And I wake up, and we are, hundreds of miles away from New York. It's great. It's like the closest thing to teleporting, taking a nap on a plane. You just open your eyes, you're somewhere else. And it was great. Well, we had a great week. On the way back, our plane, it was like when we were taking off, it was in a line with other planes because we had to wait for our turn. So we're buckled in, we're waiting to take off. And I'm not as sleepy, I'm just sitting there. So I start watching a movie. And I'm watching this movie. It's called Fall. It's new. It's about these two girls. They're adrenaline junkies, and they decide they're going to climb this abandoned radio tower, it's just a pole. It's got a ladder, and it's 2,000 feet high. And when they get to the top, the ladder breaks. And they're stranded 2,000 feet up in the middle of nowhere on this tower. And just talking about it really makes my palms sweat because whatever. And I'm watching this movie. They're hanging, they're dangling, looking down. And I'm starting to get anxious. And then I look around in the plane. And all of a sudden, I'm not too crazy about this plane taking off, right? I didn't love the idea of going, 2,000 feet is nothing compared to how high we're going in this plane. And I actually took the iPad and I shut it. I'm like, this is not the movie for this time, right? And I had a reaction to it. And looking back at it now, I'm like, what was that, right? Why? I wasn't given any new information. How is it that one day I'm in a chair, passed out, asleep, totally relaxed, loving it, taking off, don't care. But then on another day, I'm the same person, I know the same amount of information, and now I'm sensitive to the turbulence. I'm just going through all these hypothetical situations. And I'm sure you've probably been here, right? Like maybe you've been in situations where you feel the doubt creep into what was a situation of complete confidence. Like maybe at home, you're comfortable in your house, comfortable with the lights out, it's a nice place, whatever, but then you watch a scary movie about someone who breaks into houses. And then all of a sudden you're like walking through the hallway a little more careful, a little more, or I don't know, maybe I'm the only one. Right? But it's like, what happened there? Did you learn something about the crime rates in your area that gave you a legitimate reason to be afraid? Why? Where does this doubt just come from? Jesus actually addressed this idea of doubt that just has the ability to completely take over a situation where you're feeling confident. And it often comes, like this situation often happens after you take a step of faith or after a moment of confidence. And it's in a story that seems like it's so out there, it runs the risk of being written off as totally impractical, but it's one of the most practical illustrations we have of what faith actually looks like with doubt. When doubt enters the faith situation, it's the story of Jesus walking on water. Now, if you're like me, like maybe you hear that story and you're like, okay, cool, like that was one of his things, right? Jesus walked on water, so pretty much no one else does that, right? But I just would kind of read that or hear about it and be like, nice, and move on to the next one, because I don't see myself in a situation where I need to do that, and probably won't, and you probably won't either. And so it just really, that story often did very little for me. But in this story, we see something that we need to understand. Whether you're someone who completely believes and is totally on board, or maybe you're like just kicking the tires and considering the possibility of trusting God. So here's what it looks like, right? This was written by Matthew, who was there when it happened. Jesus had just fed 5,000 people. They had their own Sunday dinner. And he sends his followers, his closest friends, he sends them off ahead of him. It says this. It says, immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. They were crossing over what we call the Sea of Galilee, which they also refer to as a lake. This was like a shortcut. Rather than going all the way around, they would often go across. And so he sends them off on their own. It says, after he dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. It's recharging, right? Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land. It was buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. This same story, it's recorded 3 times. It's in 3 different versions of the story about Jesus, what we call the Gospels. And we know there's a serious storm on this lake. Because of where this lake was, even today, geographically, storms came in like that, and they were life-threatening. If your ship sank when you were offshore, it's not like today. They didn't just send a lifeguard out on a wave runner to come scoop you up. Like, people would legitimately lose their lives in those situations. And so they're out there like rowing for hours and hours through the night. They're making no progress. They're like trying to go up on the down escalator. And Jesus goes out to them. It says, shortly before dawn, meaning they've been out all night, Jesus went out to them. How did he do it? He was walking on the lake. There it is, walking on water. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. They were scared. People don't do this. And so they're caught off guard. They're tired. They're drained. They're exhausted. It says, it's a ghost. They don't even recognize him. And they cry out in fear. Jesus replies, it says, immediately he says to them, take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. Now, there's kind of something cool going on here. Those people, those followers of Jesus, they would have grown up studying like ancient Jewish history, what we would refer to as the Old Testament. And in the Old Testament, there were all these really cool things that happened with water. Water often showed up in chaotic situations and represented the uncertainty and the chaos in life. And so Jesus is kind of manufacturing this situation. Like it says he made them get out on the boat. He wants them to learn something. And in what they had grown up learning, there were some cool things that would happen on the water. Like if you know the story of Moses, he parted the sea, right? That was a big deal. Joshua, who came after Moses, did something else cool with the water. And there were people after that who did neat things in water. However, these people believed that only God could trod on the water. And so Jesus comes walking out on the water and he says, take courage. Why? He says, it is I. In the original language, it's actually one word. It's the word I am, which is how in their version of the Bible, God identifies himself by saying, I am. He does it with Moses and the burning bush, if you're familiar with that story. And so there's something really powerful going on here. Jesus is showing them a side of him that they didn't completely understand at that point. And then here it is, right? And here's where it gets practical. Peter, who's always got something to say. I like this guy, just says what's on his mind. He says, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come out to you on the water. And Jesus says, come. Now I don't get this. You know, this is interesting. He's like, what's the point? Why not like, hey, if it's you, get in the boat, you know? Like, he's like a little kid, like, can I try that, right? Jesus is out there, he's like, if it's you, if you are who you say you are, tell me to come out on the water. What Peter is doing, right? And hopefully this is where we make the connection. What Peter is doing is he's expressing the confidence and the willingness to take a step of faith because of who he sees Jesus to be. What we could call this is like clarity-inspired confidence. In light of what he's seeing, he's willing to do something he wasn't previously willing to do. He's willing to take a step he wasn't previously willing to take. Now, I don't know about you, but I've been here before, where I'm sitting in a seat like you are or similar to it, and maybe there's someone up here talking, and I hear something. Or maybe it's in a song, and something comes to mind. And all of a sudden, it's like I'm given a glimpse of God that is just so clear. And I'm inspired with confidence. And I'm willing to take a step that I hadn't been willing to take up to that point. And it could be anything, right? Like maybe you're here when we're talking about marriage, and it's like, you know what? I really do need to do X, Y, and Z. And in the moment you're hearing it and it's like, it's so clear. Or maybe there's something you've given up on and you're like, you know what? I really need to get back to that. Or there's something you need to give up. And in that moment, you're like, I finally got to kick that. Or I got to get back to trying to do this. Or I got to go to that place. I got to fix this relationship. I got to make this phone call. I got to write that check. I got to visit that person. There's something that you have to do. And in a moment, maybe sitting in a chair, maybe listening to someone singing a song, but in a moment, in light of what you're seeing about God, you're inspired with confidence and ready to take the next step. And that's where Peter is. That's where he is. It says, then Peter got down out of the boat. What does he do? He walked on the water and came toward Jesus. He's doing it. Something he would have never thought he'd be capable of doing because of the confidence that he's been given. Because of how clearly he's seeing who Jesus is. But when he saw the wind, which I don't even know how you do that. I don't know what the wind looks like. He was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." He is filled with confidence. He's willing to take the step. He steps out of the boat, and all of a sudden, he's confronted with every reason why he shouldn't be where he is, why it doesn't make sense. He sees the wind, and I think that's the perfect word, right? Like he sees the rain going sideways. He sees what the wind is doing. He sees the water. He sees the waves, and immediately he's hit with just waves of doubt. He has taken his focus off of the one who has inspired him with confidence and is now looking at all the reasons why this shouldn't be happening. And so he sinks. And Jesus here is trying to show him something powerful. Your focus has the ability to make or break your faith. This is what happened to me on the plane. I had learned no new information. There was no divine revelation. I didn't learn anything about safety of planes but just seeing like height and danger and spending some time engaging in that created doubt within me, like sucked away my confidence. My focus radically changed the way that I felt just because of what I was willingly exposing myself to. And it has the ability to do that with your faith. You know, we've talked about shame here before, right? We did an entire series on shame. And maybe you heard that series and like you heard we were talking about and you left here thinking like, yes, I'm enough, right? Like I believe that. I know I'm gonna fall short, but I know that in God's eyes, like I am good with him. I don't have to keep performing to earn my worth. And you're like totally convinced. But all it takes is for you to whip out your phone, sit down, get on Instagram and like doom scroll for 3 hours. And you see what everybody else is doing better than you're doing. And though you may not be given any more new information, you knew other people were doing what you were doing. All of a sudden you feel like garbage. And that confidence that you're enough just gone. In the wind. In the wind. And maybe you've sat here, maybe in this room, maybe in another church, maybe at home listening to something or listening to a song, and you feel that confidence, right? You're like, I gotta make that phone call. I gotta visit that person. I gotta have that conversation. I gotta do that thing. I gotta start that thing. I gotta take that step. I'm ready. It's so clear. This is the thing I need to do. And then what happens? Then the service ends. You go downstairs. You pick up your kid and you can't figure out, do I got the tag or does, my husband got the tag? And then, you get them and now they got to go to the bathroom. So now you got to go swim upstream against traffic, bring them back to the bathroom. They get water all over them. You got a missed voicemail from your mother-in-law. You get in the car. You got to stop at the grocery store. And it's just waves. Like, that thing that was so clear a while ago, you lost focus. And it's gone. It's not because you did something wrong, but you saw the waves. And it got swept away because we lose focus. Now, what I'm not saying here is that we should be willfully ignorant. But there is a difference between legitimate concerns and vague negativity. What we're talking about here really is like what we might call directed focus, intentional focus, and disciplined thought. Meaning you are paying attention to what you're paying attention to. So for me, like the time when I think Allie and I learned this I don't know, the most intensely, you can say, is really when we decided we were gonna leave where we were and try and start a church. And what we had to do was be intentional about where we allowed our minds to go. We did homework, we did our research, we got as much help, we worked harder than we had ever worked. We did all the things we needed to do, but there was still a world of uncertainty. And we had to learn to tell the difference between a legitimate concern and vague negativity. Whether people, some very, very well-intentioned people would often dump their doubts all over us. And just be like, well, do you know anyone over there? Is anybody gonna show up? Do you have a place to meet? Or where are you gonna get this money from? Are people like, and just all this like wind and waves and whatever. And we had to actually be aware of how much time we spent in conversations like that. And we wouldn't be mean, but we'd just be like, oh yeah, there's some things we just can't know. We're trying our best though. How's your dog? And just like change the subject. Now, if someone came up to us and was like, I heard you're trying to raise X amount of dollars, I think you should try and raise Y. That is a legitimate concern, right? It's a specific thing we can give attention to. You see the difference between vague negativity and legitimate concerns? Something you could do something about? It's amazing right now. It's amazing how many people who at one point were so confident that God had them, right? That things weren't always gonna be good, but they could rest knowing that there's a God in heaven who loves them. How many of us have had our cages rattled simply because of the amount of news we've allowed ourselves to take in? And I'm not saying I'm not telling you to be willfully ignorant, like I said. But if you just, whether it's on purpose or on accident, you're just listening to hours and hours and hours and hours of fear and negativity, you can't expect to walk away from that feeling comfortable. We have to be disciplined about what we allow ourselves to take in and where we allow our minds to go. And when it comes to faith, understand what your waves look like. If you hear something and you're like, I really gotta make that phone call, maybe you write it down and you put it in your pocket and okay, after this, we're going into chaos mode, right? We gotta go visit these people, do that, and my mind's not gonna be there. But there will be a time when I return to this and I refocus, bring myself back to that place when I saw clearly what my next step was. And you watch how it changes things. What's amazing about this story is the way that Jesus responds, which is something that often we misunderstand. Peter sinks, he calls out, he says, Lord, save me. And immediately, Jesus reaches out his hand and he catches him. He says this, ready? Here it is. Here it is. You might be familiar with these words. He says, you of little faith. Why did you doubt? Tisk, tisk. And those, for me, those were the words that made me feel guilty when I doubted. I just have such little faith. Why did I doubt? If I were Peter, you give some thought to this. I don't know. I think that's pretty legitimate. Peter could have been like, well, I'm standing on water. No one's ever done that before, up until about 35 seconds ago. There seems to be some legitimate reasons there why he's doubting. This verse is a good example of how sometimes we impose our emotions onto the translation. Or we read a critical view of God into the text. This phrase here, you of little faith, it's really one word. It's of little faith, and there's an assumed subject, which is you, so that we know Jesus is talking to Peter. But in English, when you start a sentence with you, it immediately sounds combative. And what I'm trying to say here is that what Jesus is expressing is simply, Peter, your faith is small. And if you rewind the tape and think about that, Peter has just been the only person out of a boat full of people who has stepped out, and his radical faith has allowed him to take steps on top of the water in the direction of Jesus. And Jesus is looking at him saying, like, Peter, you have only begun to scratch the surface. There is still so much more Peter is going to learn to trust Jesus with. You are here today because Peter learned how to trust Jesus. This continued for 2,000 years. He's saying, like, this has only just begun. And why did he doubt? Well, Matthew tells us exactly why he doubted. It's because his focus drifted to all the reasons why he shouldn't be where he is. And so he sinks. He sinks. If we're not careful, we could walk away from this feeling like Jesus is just beating people up who aren't sure about him. But what's kind of cool is that Matthew, he uses his words very intentionally. And there's this one word that appears 3 times. 3 times. It's the word immediately. It says immediately Jesus sent his disciples out on the boat. Like, Jesus is doing something very intentionally here. This is a setup. He's manufacturing a situation to teach them a lesson. They're afraid. It says immediately Jesus said, take courage. It's me. He immediately comforts them. Peter begins to sink. It says immediately Jesus grabs him. This is a story about, like, Jesus inviting people to be confident in him and comforting them when that confidence is shaken. He's showing Peter that there is so much he'll be able to trust him with, even in the craziness of life's uncertain storms. But he has to remember those moments of clarity. His focus has to be directed, and his thought has to be disciplined. I'm gonna ask the band to come up here, and then we'll wrap up. So my son, I have a 6-year-old son who never cleans his room. But that's irrelevant. We go to the beach sometimes, and he loves the water, and he sits in the area where the waves break. Like, and we try to tell him, like, okay, you gotta go a little further, get past where it's just gonna nail you. But he just sits there, and it's like one after, like, he doesn't know they're coming, right? One after the next, just boom, crush, boom, crush, boom, crush. And then he gets back up, he goes back into it, right? For some of us, like, that's what these waves of doubt are doing to us. And it's because probably on a very practical level, we're just not aware of the things that steal our attention, of the things that make us forget those moments of confidence when it's so clear what we need to do. And so maybe there's been a point, maybe you've taken a step, but your intentions have been swept away by the wind, by the waves. My challenge for you this week is really to think about those things and think about what your waves look like. And if we'll learn to identify our waves, we might see like Peter that day, like what Jesus wanted Peter to see that day, that our faith in him has only scratched the surface, that there's so much more that we can trust him with.